So let me thank, besides, Roman and Frank personally, let me also thank the Canadian Institute for Ukrainian Studies and University of Toronto. As Roman said, I'm an alumni of University of Toronto. I'm incredibly nostalgic about University of Toronto. I was only here for a year. I was really only here for 10 months doing my MA, but it was a great year. It was a seminal year. I took with Lynn Viola that year, and Lynn is sadly sick at the moment and can't be here today, was the best seminar I've ever taken, at any university in my life. And it was the moment when I really felt like intellectually I got inside Soviet history and inside the Soviet experience. It was a fantastic cohort we had that year. There were various people who had come from the former Soviet Union and from Soviet Ukraine in that class, and I still think back on it as a kind of seminal intellectual moment. And I just loved living in Toronto. Let me also mention that today is coincidentally the 75th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which I couldn't not mention because it seems like such a fitting moment to talk about rebellion and revolution. Marek Edelman, one of a handful of people to survive that uprising, he was the Bundist commander of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, said later in a long, famous interview he did with Hannah Krall, it was only a choice as to a manner of dying. And there was many people speaking at that time and since then about that uprising as a decision to die with dignity, and what it meant to die with dignity. And Edelman himself, who was one of the architects and the leaders of that uprising, was very hesitant to say that. He always said everybody who died, died with dignity. The people who died in the gas chambers also died with dignity. But we had absorbed the idea that it was more noble and more dignified to die fighting, and so we were going to die fighting. But this idea that was so dominant around among the people who carried out that uprising and in the discussions that followed about what it meant to assert selfhood, and what it meant to live with dignity, I think is a fitting introduction in some sense to the Maidan, because dignity, both as a word and as an idea, very much reappeared, on the Maidan. And I'll talk a little bit about what I think that means, or what the significance of that was. I'm a so-called intellectual historian, so I like to talk about language and ideas and the way that people use language and ideas. Okay. So let me first say about this book, which if you haven't read it, is perhaps not what you expect it to be. I'm not a political scientist in any way, nor am I an expert either on post-Soviet politics in general or post-Soviet independent Ukraine in particular. As Roman said, I'm a historian of European intellectual history, and my research has always focused it on East and Central Europe. This was a book I never planned to write. In some sense, I specifically intended not to write. As a historian, all of our advantages over the political commentators and the policy people and the political scientists and the sociologists, all of them come from retrospect. We can know more looking back than any individual actor could ever know in real time. Both because we can gather more sources, we can find out what A was saying to B and what B was saying to A, but also what B was saying to C and what C was saying to D, and we can gather more than any person in real time could. And also for the reason that Hannah Arendt gives when she says that the actor is never the author of his or her life story. It's only the historian looking back who can say what it was all about. And that is because actions not only occasionally, but as a rule, have consequences far in excess of their intentions. This is what Hannah Arendt calls the boundlessness of human interrelatedness. And so the ripples of meaning of actions only play themselves out with time. And the ways in which historians get to play God and get to seem omniscient all comes from the advantages of retrospect. So now, having said that, let me maybe tell you a bit about how I came to write the book I was determined not to write. And I think that will kind of give you a sense, as I kind of move into the story of the Maidan, of how I approached that story and what the book is about. So I got myself involved in Eastern Europe. Roman was asking me this at lunch. You know, not for any kind of ethnic or racial or personal reason in that sense, but because I was at a very impressionable age in 1989. You know, I'm American, I'm not Canadian, and I think our experience of the Cold War might have been somewhat more intense than it was in Canada. You know, so I was the last generation to grow up during the Cold War. It was Reagan, it was the evil empire, it was Bush, it was the constant threat that there would be a nuclear war, it was the Iron Curtain. And then one day, when I was 17, literally, more or less from one day to the next, that was all over. And the seductiveness of that moment was overwhelming. And when I first went to Prague, Prague was just filled with Americans exactly like myself. Most of them eventually got over it, and they went home, and they got a life. And I never did, which is why you see me here. But I was drawn to Eastern Europe not only because something that was closed opened, but also because in that opening, Eastern Europe revealed a language that I had never heard or encountered as I was a teenager coming of age in American politics. And I'm sorry that Paul Wilson no longer lives in Toronto, because otherwise I would have tried to bring him here and give him some acknowledgments. But one of the first things I read were Václav Havel's essays and Paul Wilson's very, very beautiful translation. I want to acknowledge the translators. And of course, Havel's language in particular, and the language of dissent in former Czechoslovakia in general, was full of words like truth and dignity and consciousness and being that you would never hear an American politician using. You know, I was very taken by this idea of living in truth. I didn't know what it meant, of course, but it sounded very beautiful, and it certainly sounded much more beautiful than anything Reagan or Bush ever said. And then when I had just turned 18, I mean literally kind of days after my birthday, as I was kind of coming of the age to vote for the first time, Václav Havel, as the first post-communist president of Czechoslovakia, some 6 weeks after he became president, in February 1990, comes to Washington to give a speech before, you know, a joint session of the American Congress. And he stands up there and says, "Consciousness precedes being," and not the other way around, as the Marxists claim. Now, I didn't know what it meant, but it sounded very, very beautiful. Looking back, I think the chances that many of our congressmen or senators remembered that passage from German ideology where Marx and Engels talk about how being precedes consciousness, and consciousness is simply derivative of one's, you know, objective position, the socioeconomic structure. The chances that anyone remembered that are slim. The reference was probably generally lost. Nevertheless, it was the moment when I think, you know, I was not the only one who kind of fell in love with Václav Havel. What Havel meant by that, as it increasingly became clear to me the more I kind of read into that tradition, was that consciousness, how we think, how we relate to the world subjectively, our responsibility for forming an attitude and making decisions about our relationship to the world, that is prior to and transcendent of any kind of socioeconomic circumstances. That is prior to and transcendent of any kind of constraints. And I later came to understand that little fragment of that speech was actually very revealing of a deeper philosophy of dissent, not only in Czechoslovakia, but more generally in Eastern Europe, especially in the second half of the communist period. Now, Adam Michnik had this idea he called as if. And as if for Adam was, we should live as if we were free people. That is, we should live as if we bore responsibility for all of our actions, regardless of any kind of political constraints. We have to create that mindset for us, that space for us. And in fact, it was Adam, it turns out, who brings in the word, which in Polish is podmiotowość, subjectivity, into the conversation in the 1970s. And he said that solidarity is about subjectivity, is about coming to one's own subjectivity. It was about society affirming its own subjectivity. It was about being a subject and not an object. It was being a responsible actor and an agent, you know, and not a plaything and not an object. The great Czech philosopher Jan Patočka, who was kind of so important as a kind of Socrates figure to these people, said, the thing about responsibility is that we carry it with us everywhere. So I had, you know, these ideas that first in their very, very kind of nascent primitive form I began to kind of take in as an 18-year-old. You know, now, 20-some years later, having been increasingly intrigued by the questions of where that language came from, and how it played out, in 2013, I was in Vienna at the Institute for Human Sciences, which was originally founded as a place to which to smuggle out Jan Patočka's archive after he died, following brutal interrogation in Czechoslovakia. And I was there working on a book about phenomenology and existentialism in Eastern Europe, and looking at the origins of that philosophy of dissent. And it turned out that, of course, the story was much more complicated than I thought it was, and these ideas about subjectivity and individual dignity and responsibility had very complicated philosophical origins. I also began to see that precisely after 1968, when that continental philosophical tradition in France went in the direction of post-structuralism in particular and postmodernism in general, that is a kind of skepticism towards the idea that there is anything as a kind of determinate, fixed, stable, constant subject, that there is anything as kind of stable truth, as there is any such thing as stable meaning, that was all cast into doubt. That was all seen as, you know, perhaps a relic of totalitarian thinking that needed to be deconstructed. And interestingly, those same philosophical references in Eastern Europe after 1968 went in the direction of an insistence on continuing to look for truth. And in some sense, for people like Václav Havel, the kind of the ontological reality of truth was proven by contrast with the ontological reality of lies. You knew that you were living in a system that was based on lies, therefore you had to believe that there was such a thing as truth. And you had to keep looking for it. And you had to believe there was such a thing as a self, even when it seemed like it was being squashed. You know, and that was your kind of mode of defense in some sense. That was your mode of resistance. The move was basically that epistemological questions are always already ethical questions. The great Polish philosopher Leszek Kołakowski, after he was kicked out of Poland following the events of 1968, he goes to Yale to deliver these lectures on Edmund Husserl, who was the founder of phenomenology. And basically Husserl is trying to say that yes, we can get to epistemological certainty and absolute truth. Yes, we can know the world. Yes, there is a way to get from consciousness to being, from mind to world, from inner to outer. He was the Obama figure. He was the yes, we can guy. And Kołakowski exhaustively goes through this. And he says, Husserl fails. He fails because the problem of that bridge from subject to object is insoluble. There is no magical passage. But, Kołakowski says, you have to bracket that knowledge that you're never going to get to epistemological certainty and absolute truth. You have to put that aside and you have to keep looking. Because if you give up on truth, you've given up on ethics. And that was the move. Epistemological questions are moral questions. So it's a very complex and kind of beautiful tradition. I hope I didn't lose you guys with too much phenomenological philosophy. But the short then version of that story was that that tradition really fades after 1989. And those kinds of questions as having a kind of immediate personal political relevance, that starts to fade. And in 2013, as we were coming up on the 25th anniversary of 1989, of the fall of communism in Eastern Europe, the Polish philosopher and solidarity veteran Marcin Król wrote a very kind of self-critical book, essentially saying we were stupid. And a journalist from Gazeta Wyborcza comes to him and says, well, what are you talking about? And Marcin says, well, look, we're going through a non-trivial economic crisis, you know, a serious political crisis, and a potentially fatal spiritual crisis. And the journalist says, well, what's the fatal spiritual crisis? And Marcin says, we've stopped asking ourselves questions. And the journalist says, what kind of questions? And Marcin says, metaphysical questions. We've stopped asking ourselves, for instance, where does evil come from? And in one of their last conversations before Václav Havel's death, Adam Michnik and Václav Havel were lamenting the fact that there was now a new generation that seemed not to care about values, that seemed to have gotten lost to consumer capitalism. You know, and Adam says to Havel, he says, this is a civilization that needs metaphysics. 25 years after 1989, on the Maidan, that watching, even from afar, that was the moment when I understood that this was the return of metaphysics. This was the return of metaphysics to Eastern Europe. For me, it was a reminder of the very human stakes of all of these philosophical questions that I was working on. And it was the most extraordinary thing I had seen play out in real time in all the, you know, now quarter century I've been hanging out in Eastern Europe. And that made it very hard to turn away from it, even though I found that there are all sorts of reasons why I shouldn't write. It made it very hard to turn away from it. Let me take you through a little bit of the narrative. I'm sure most of you know it, but for those of you who are fuzzy, let me kind of maybe tease out some main points. And so you probably remember the Orange Revolution of 2004. The presidential election between Viktor Yanukovych and Viktor Yushchenko. And Viktor Yanukovych is kind of the, you know, hoodlum turned gangster turned oligarch, you know, Kremlin favorite. And Viktor Yushchenko seems to be the one who is more European looking, more Western looking, you know, wanting to move Ukraine towards Europe and the rule of law. And as a result of election fraud and an attempt to poison Yushchenko with dioxin, Yanukovych has declared the winner. And at that point, Ukrainians go out into the streets. And they go out into the Maidan. And for those of you who haven't been to Kiev, it's important to the whole story that the Maidan, which is the central square in Kiev, is really big. I mean, it's an unusually large central square. It's also geographically a very complex space. It's multi-leveled. You know, there's a kind of shopping center underneath on part of it. If you afterwards, you can go look up pictures. But it's a place that a lot can be done with. You know, there's room for lots of people to set up tents and set up kitchens and live there for an extended period of time. And in 2004, Ukrainians go out to the Maidan and they stay there for 3 weeks and they freeze and they win. The elections are done over. Yushchenko is declared the winner and everybody's happy and they go home. And then, of course, the short version of that story is that things fall apart. And it doesn't work out well, you know, and for whatever reason, or as Freud would say, for overdetermined reasons, whether because Yushchenko and Yulia Tymoshenko fall out, whether because of corruption, you know, whether because he was never the same after the dioxin poisoning, because the system was too intransigent, for whatever reason, he is not the savior figure that people are hoping he would be. There's widespread disillusionment. In the meantime, in the background, Yanukovych has not given up, which I find kind of remarkable. I mean, one of the things I found about Yanukovych that was so remarkable was that he precisely that he seems so unremarkable. I mean, not only is he a gangster, but he's kind of nakedly, unapologetically a gangster. I mean, he's not even like a Putin figure who is selling people a grand narrative, you know, or a kind of, you know, metaphysical story or higher purpose for their suffering, or he's not especially charismatic. Like, it's unclear, like, what would possibly allow him to come back. But he gets this guy that he imports from the United States, because it turns out that we Americans have this special little boutique industry of PR for gangsters with presidential ambitions. This, unfortunately, is not a joke. I wish it were. And so, you know, Paul Manafort flies over to Ukraine, and he doesn't know Ukrainian, and he doesn't know Russian, but no matter. I mean, he kind of, you know, gets Yanukovych some new clothes and a new haircut, and personally, I don't really see the great effect. It didn't look that different to me at all, but I'm not an expert on this, and, you know, strangely enough, it works, and in 2010, Yanukovych comes back and legitimately wins the presidential election in Ukraine. And nobody I've talked to has disputed the legitimacy of that 2010 election. I can maybe say as a footnote or a side note, I know you're, I'm not speaking to Americans here, but I'm hoping you'll empathize with me that after our elections in November 2016, that Wednesday morning after the Tuesday elections, I was lying on the floor of my office at Yale throwing up into a plastic bag. And the first person who called me was Slava Vakarchuk, the Ukrainian rock star from Kiev, who's a friend of ours. And he said, you know, Marci, I'm calling to offer my moral support. And it's like, I think I know how you feel. You know, this was kind of how I felt in 2010 when I realized that we actually voted for Yanukovych. And maybe this is something societies have to go through and learn from their mistakes. You know, like, finally, he's like, Marci, please get up off the floor. You have two beautiful children. In any case, you know, Yanukovych comes back. You know, and he's still himself. I mean, he still seems kind of ordinary and gangster-like to me, but again, I'm not an expert. But he is ostensibly leading Ukraine on this course towards European integration. And what I only came to appreciate and think in recent years through working more closely with Ukrainian students, and especially Ukrainian graduate students, or the students of my friends and colleagues in Ukraine, is that potential opening to the European Union meant everything if you were a young student. You know, if you were 15 or 18 or 22, whether or not you would be able to go on Erasmus exchanges, whether or not you would be able to study at universities in other European countries, whether you'd be eligible for internships in Brussels, whether you would be able to even go to conferences, you know, without spending months humiliating yourself and waiting in bureaucratic lines to plead for a visa, that was everything. You know, that was the future going to be open to you? You know, would you have the chance to learn English or German or French or whatever well enough that you could really have an international career, or that you could travel, that you could be in touch with other people in your field? It meant everything to those people. And in 2013, Yanukovych was scheduled to sign this association agreement with the European Union. And the agreement, you know, from my understanding of the agreement, was not fantastic. I mean, it would have involved Ukraine's incurring high cost to meet the conditions of reforms on their side. It likely would have provoked retaliation from the Kremlin. And it promised, at the end of the day, no eventual membership in the European Union. That said, you know, it was a foot in the door. You know, it was a symbolic step, it was a gesture, it was a sign that we are, you know, committing to undertaking certain reforms, that we are moving towards Europe, that we want to be open to Europe, that we want Europe to be open to us. And then at the 11th hour, when this very nice signing ceremony in Vilnius had already been prepared and people had chosen the pens and the napkins and all that kind of stuff, suddenly at the 11th hour on November 21st, Yanukovych announced that he was not going to sign. And nothing might have happened, had not this 32-year-old Afghan Ukrainian journalist posted on Facebook in Russian, this note saying, hey guys, if you're really upset, come out to the Maidan by midnight tonight. And then he said, likes do not count. Now, interestingly, I found in the English press coverage that sentence often got mistranslated, which is strange because, as someone who dabbles a lot in translation, it's one of those rare, precious moments when the Slavic translates perfectly into English. It's like nie czytająca. It's literally likes do not count. And I thought that was a remarkable sentence because it's a sentence that would have been meaningless before Facebook. It would have been utterly devoid of meaning. Likes do not count. And suddenly that little likes do not count, is going to become a revolutionary slogan for the 21st century. So people come out to the Maidan, mostly young people, mostly students and student-age people. They come out, a couple hundred, several hundred. They're not particularly interested in opposition political parties. They're not especially concerned with what's happening to Yulia Tymoshenko. They're not very interested in language politics or ethnic politics. Their thing is Ukraine is Europe. And they hold hands and they sing and they dance and they themselves Euromaidan. And they're there, and it's getting colder and colder. And again, that might have all faded away had not, Yanukovych, for whatever reason, and I don't pretend to have any special epistemological access to what was going on inside his head, decided, on November 30th that he was going to send out Berkut, his riot police, to brutally beat up the students. Presumably with the assumption that then the parents will come pull their kids off the street. And I think the intention was not to kill anybody, and he didn't kill anybody, but the intention was to be violent enough that it would be a shock. There was a certain kind of unspoken social contract that despite all the abuse and all the corruption and all the injustice, that the government wasn't actually going to use violence against its own citizens en masse. But they came out, Berkut came out at 4 in the morning and brutally beat up the students and anybody else who was on the square with them. And one of the stories I tell in the book is about one of the student activists, Marci Prohasko, who was a student of journalism at that time at the Ukrainian Catholic University in Lviv. And on the third day, November 24th, he goes to Kiev. And he's there night and day on the Maidan. And around 2 in the morning on that night of November 30th, he's exhausted and he leaves and he goes to a friend's apartment, he turns off his phone and he goes to sleep. He doesn't wake up for another 10 hours. But in the meantime, his father, Taras Prohasko, who is a famous novelist and lives in Ivano-Frankivsk, Taras, like you might imagine, gets a phone call in the middle of the night, telling him what's happened. And as you might imagine, he immediately calls his son, who then doesn't pick up the phone. And so he gets more and more upset. Like, I'm sure many of you are parents. You can imagine. He gets more and more upset. He keeps calling and calling. He calls Marcian. He calls Marcian's friends. He calls his friends. He calls all the hospitals. He starts calling from the police stations. Nobody knows where Marcian is. He's trying to prepare for the worst. Finally, late that morning, Marcian wakes up. He sees that he has 100 phone calls. He calls his father, he calls his mother, he calls his girlfriend, who posts on Facebook that Marcian is okay. In the meantime, Taras gets in his car and drives all night to get to Kiev and find Marcian. And here is where that remarkable moment happens. Because Yanukovych is counting on the fact that now the parents are going to pull the kids off the streets. And Taras drives and he finds Marcian, but he doesn't bring him home. He joins him there. And as a historian, this is an extraordinary moment. It's this kind of Aufhebung, Hegel would say, this kind of overcoming of Oedipal rebellion. There's so many revolutions. The whole history of communism could be plotted as a history of Oedipal rebellions, each generation rising up in turn against the parents. That was certainly true in 1968 in all different parts of the world. And now suddenly, instead of the children rising up against the parents, instead of the parents trying to pull their kids home, the parents join their kids there. You know, and a day later, you have close to 1 million people on the streets in Kiev. No one has ever seen this many people on the streets of Kiev. You know, and now the slogan is, we will not let them beat our children. It cannot be permitted. We will not let them beat our children. And I noticed people were saying this even who didn't have children there themselves. And that's when everything turned. And that was mesmerizing. I mean, that was something historically that really very, very rarely happens. One of the kids, literally a kid, he was 16, I talked to, who was beaten up that night. And he wasn't even a university student. He was still a high school student. He was living with his mother. And when I met him later in Kiev, I said, you know, your mother must have been very upset, but she let you go back. And he said, my mother was making Molotov cocktails on Hrushevskaya Street. And that is arguably when Euromaidan just Became Maidan, with no prefix. And arguably that's when it became about something much more than an association agreement with the European Union, and drew many people who were not necessarily particularly concerned about the association agreement with the European Union. I mean, now it was really a revolt, you know, and a kind of impassioned revolt against brutality. And it was a revolt against something that in Russian is called произвол, which is a word we don't have in English. It literally means arbitrariness. But arbitrariness in this kind of tinge with tyranny, you know, capriciousness, the sense that you are rendered a mere toy or plaything of the powers that be. You know, it's being treated as an object and not as a subject. And again, as a historian, this was very interesting because it's a word that both we don't have in English, and historians are always very attentive when these moments don't translate, but it also has a very long history. A few years ago, I had a graduate student who wrote a dissertation about, you know, circles of liberal journalists in the 19th century Tsarist Empire, you know, and they were all, you know, revolting against произвол. And I think now what Europe came to mean on the Maidan was not just, you know, the kind of empirical, obviously highly imperfect, actually existing particular instantiation of the European Union, but it was Europe as the kind of Platonic essence of Europeness. It was Europe as the antithesis of произвол. It was Europe as the rule of law, as human rights, as human dignity. It was Europe as a place where you can be treated as a subject and not as an object. It was Europe in the sense that famously, when Gandhi was once asked what he thought of Western civilization, he replied, "It would be a very good thing." Yeah. It was that Europe that would be a very good thing that was at stake. And similarly, the Maidan now became, as it became about something much larger than the association agreement, it also became something much larger than a protest. There was an essay written back in the late 70s by a Czech Catholic philosopher named Václav Benda, circulated in Samizdat, now long forgotten, but translated by the same Paul Wilson, by the way, called The Parallel Polis, which articulated an idea of dissent that was not necessarily political rebellion and was certainly nonviolent, but was a creation of a kind of alternative society where you live by and kind of realize the values that you are opposing to those which are being inflicted on you by the regime. The Maidan was a parallel polis. You know, it was a whole parallel world. It was a whole parallel society. It was a masterful feat of self-organization, a word that does, in fact, translate very cleanly into English. Samoorganizacja, people, and that actually works in English. It was this kind of revelation, you know, of what a nascent civil society could do, and I don't think people themselves had any idea that it could all explode so quickly, because within a few days you had communal kitchens, you had clothing distribution, you had an open university, you had film screenings, there was a piano, there was a stage, there were medical points, there was this whole other world. People were living there. People were eating there. Whole families were coming there. You know, this was this assertion, you know, of subjectivity. This was this assertion that we are subjects and not objects, you know, and that we can do things and not only be the victims of things. One of my Polish historian friends who I talked to during that time, he said to me, you know, in Polish, he said, "Well, Marci, subjectivity, the last time I heard that word was during the days of Solidarity." And now it was back. It was also, and I want to speak here about solidarity in Poland a moment, because I was in this strange position of, I was an American watching the Maidan primarily from Vienna. I was at this research institute that has traditionally been a meeting place for West European and East European intellectuals. I had several Ukrainian friends and colleagues who were fellows there that year who were shuttling back and forth between Vienna and Kiev. And it was, you know, the book is in many ways, you know, a response to the daily conversations that I had with them, and a kind of absorption of the transformation that they were experiencing. But I was also in some ways an American in Vienna watching the Maidan through Polish eyes. I followed the coverage in Polish very intensely, in part because it was much better than the German or the English coverage, and I read in Polish faster than I read in Russian. But it was also because I was seeing something that for years I had heard stories about from my Polish friends who are significantly older than I am and who are veterans of Solidarity. You know, and this experience of overcoming boundaries. You know, the reason why subjectivity was so important in Solidarity was not only because of the regime's attempt to squash people and render them objects, but also because it was a declaration of something that was beyond politics. And people like Konstanty Gebert and Jan Gross and Adam Michnik were saying, there's no more left and right, you know, it's not, and we're no longer divided into Marxist and Catholics. Now this is about an assertion of our subjectivity as human beings. You know, and Solidarity was this remarkable moment of all this overcoming of boundaries, where people from all different kinds of political groupings, from the left, from the right, you know, and men and women and workers and intellectuals and parents and children came together. There's a famous Polish film by the great director Andrzej Wajda called Człowiek Żelaza, Man of Iron, that tells this drama in two very quick anecdotes. It begins in March 1968 with the student revolt in Poland. And the son in this film goes to his father, who's a shipyard worker, while the students are demonstrating and being beaten by the police, and ask his father to bring out the workers in support of the students. And the father slaps him. He says no. He locks him in the room. He says, "Son, when the time is right, we'll go together." And the son is livid. He says, "No, we will never march together. I will never forgive you, and we will never march together." 2 years later, in 1970, in Poland, it's the shipyard workers who protest. And now in the film, the father goes to his son. And the son essentially says, "Hey, you let us down 2 years ago, now you go to hell." And the miracle that was Solidarity was the coming together, not just of the right and the left and the Catholics and the Marxists and the Poles and the Jews and the workers and the intellectuals, but also those fathers and those sons. And what I saw through the eyes of my Polish friends who were veterans of Solidarity was that they knew only too well that kind of miraculous transcendence of boundaries, it lasted 30 seconds after communism fell. You know, I mean, it didn't afterwards, it didn't last for a moment. They understood better than anybody that it was something, that kind of solidarity, that kind of coming together, was something extraordinarily fragile and precarious, and no one has ever been able to sustain it. But they also knew that it was something extraordinarily precious that most people never experience, and that they never counted on living to see a second time. And that was what Hannah Arendt calls, the lost treasure of revolution, something that is beyond victory or defeat. So let me just, I won't talk for too much longer, but let me say a little bit about how I approach all this in this book that I never intended to write. And as I said before, the book in some ways is an act of translation. It's an act of cultural mediation, and it's an act of translation that owes everything really to my Ukrainian friends and colleagues. And it was, in some sense, the combination of being absorbed in their stories and absorbed in the Polish stories, and being this American in Vienna, that I felt at a certain point how much they felt not understood. And why were they not being understood? And why were their experiences, were they too particular or were they too universal? And that was why people rejected them. And so as I began to write, I thought of it really as not as a political analysis, and there's almost no political analysis in this book. I don't go into geopolitics. I don't make any policy recommendations. I have no idea really who should put sanctions on whom in exactly at what sectors. But I try to translate the transformative experience that people were having. Because at a certain moment I understood that this was not just a political transformation, this was a kind of transformation of human souls, and I was watching that happen in front of me. And that was something I couldn't turn away from. And it also caused me, I think, the combination of thinking about Poland and thinking about Ukraine and being an American caused me to really ask questions about how do you translate this experience, and what is particular and what is universal, and is it possible through a kind of a close description of the experience people are having as individuals in revolution to learn something about what is universal in the experience of revolution. So the book is about revolution as experience. It's about experience given to pure subjectivity. It's about how people experienced the Maidan. In that sense, it's very personal, although not personal about me in that sense, but personal about the interlocutors and the protagonist. And I don't try to say who is good or who is bad or who is guilty or who is innocent. It's about, it's about understanding. It's about, Jirko Prohaska is always saying verstehen in German with like the capital V. It's about understanding. How do you understand? Well, Wilhelm Dilthey said, well, for the historian to make people understand, you have to give them this experience of nacherleben. You have to kind of allow them to vicariously experience along with the protagonist that you're writing about. And that's what I try to do. And I focus on these moments that particularly struck me, in the lives and the stories and the experiences of my friends and colleagues and the friends and colleagues of my friends and colleagues. And one of those things is about, the relationship between solidarity and subjectivity. What does it mean to both kind of realize the self and overcome the self? And kind of give up the individuality to some kind of unity. At what moment is that a consummation of subjectivity? At what moment is it a loss of individuality? I started going back to Camus and the rebel, and how rebellion starts from what is most intimate and particular and the individual and reaches to the universal. So that relationship between solidarity and subjectivity, between selfhood and the whole. The experience of fear disappearing. What happens to fear at revolutionary moments? I was struck by how many people told me things like, well, it was very strange, but at a certain moment, the only place I felt calm was on the Maidan. As soon as you left, and you looked at your phone, or you went to a friend's apartment, or you turned on the television, or you turned on the computer, it was terrifying. The anxiety was unbearable. The only place you felt at peace was when you were there. And they would say, I know it doesn't make any sense because that's where I was in danger, but that's the only place I felt calm. That fear disappearing when you were actually in the middle of this place. The relationship between subjectivity and transparency. Both democracy in its own way and totalitarianism has long aspired to transparency, to kind of a complete transparency of borders between public and private. You know, people on the Maidan set up cameras themselves so they could live stream themselves. And what does it mean to set up cameras yourself so people can watch you being shot in real time? You know, Yanukovych and Putin controlled the official media. So the only way to assert your own narrative against that narrative was to turn to social media. The only way to assert your selfhood was by the complete self-violation of any kind of privacy. You know, and that dialectic between the self-violation of privacy, turning those cameras on yourself and asserting yourself, kind of completely captured me. There was that famous story with that young medic, Olesha Zhukovska, who is shot in the neck during the massacre in February. And there's blood gushing from her neck. And she types on her cell phone, you know, "I am dying," as a Twitter message. You know, and I saw that on Gazeta Wyborcza. I mean, it came up moments later, and that went around the world in seconds. You know, what does it mean for your most intimate moments to be exposed to the world as the precondition of asserting yourself to the world? She did survive, by the way. The doctors performed emergency surgery. Temporality. What happens to time during revolution? I was especially fascinated by this because one by one people started saying, you know, I don't know what happened, but then I lost track of time. Or for some reason, was that yesterday? Was that last week? I can't put this in order anymore. There was this like epidemic of people losing track of time. It bothered some people more than others. I mean, one of the people I talked to was a physicist in Dnipro, then Dnipropetrovsk, and as he was trying to kind of tell the story, he kept checking the calendar, and he's like, wait, was that then or was that? And I'm like, Pablo, it's okay, just. And he's like, no, I'm a physicist. I like precision. I don't know what happened. I can't now order these things in my head. Everybody lost track of time. They also lost track of the distinction between night and day. That boundary between night and day got effaced. You know, suddenly you could call anyone at any time of day, and that held true if you were 18, it held true if you were 75. There was no longer a distinction. And then people started talking about that fear of falling asleep. Well, why are you afraid of falling asleep? You're afraid of falling asleep because you can wake up an hour later to discover that everything, absolutely everything, is different. I mean, this is the principle of revolution. At any given moment, all previously existing rules and states of affairs can cease to be meaningful at all. What happened 5 minutes ago is irrelevant because you're now in a different world. And it reminded me of something I had entirely forgotten. And I was in New York on September 11th, 2001, and I was uptown at Columbia. But my aunt and her family lived right next to the World Trade Center. And my aunt had just dropped off my 6-year-old cousin at the elementary school, which is right next to the World Trade Center. And she was working on some project there in the library. And then she was walking back. Home, and she saw the planes hit the building. And she called her husband, who was at work several blocks away, my uncle, and he said, "Run back to the school, get Amanda, and then I want you to run north and take this route." And a few days later, when they're staying with me uptime, you know, my aunt Gail, she said, and I told him, in the beginning I told him no, and he said, you know, run back to the school, get Amanda, and I kept saying no, because I was thinking, well, she's a child, she needs to be in school, she needs to be educated, you don't just pull your kid out of school in the middle of the day, and she's not going to have a doctor's note, and later Gail said, I don't know what I was thinking, like I couldn't absorb fast enough that like those were the rules of the world that existed half an hour ago. But that world that existed half an hour ago is completely irrelevant, because that's not the world we're in now. Now we're in a completely different world, and those rules no longer obtain. When I was working on this book, by the way, I went back and read Bulgakov's White Nights, which is basically all takes place on a day in Kiev, you know, in December 1918, and he captures that beautifully. You know, that like by just, you know, hundreds of pages in this one day in Kiev in 1918, that what was true an hour ago is completely irrelevant, because the reality is changing so quickly, you know, that it's surreal. And this is what people felt. And that fear of falling asleep, the loss of a sense of time, and increasingly a readiness for violence many people never expected they had in themselves. People who were no more likely to participate in violence than I am, who wouldn't have imagined it of themselves, who certainly would not have believed it of themselves in November And it was true by the end of January, and you could feel it. I mean, even from a distance, like watching the live streaming, it was almost tangible. Like by the end of January, you knew that a critical mass of people had reached a decision and they were willing to die there, if need be. And that was terrifying. But it was, you could feel it almost palpably. Yeah, that people made that choice who would not have believed themselves that they were going to make it. And I was, I was watching people I knew, people who I see at conferences, people whose books I read. My friend Ola Chniatuk, I was talking to Roman about, Ola is a philologist. She's a professor of literature. She's a Polish translator of Ukrainian literature. She's in her 50s. She's probably in her mid-50s at the time. She's a little older than I am. She always dresses in very beautifully tailored clothing. She's a very kind of petite, slim woman who always looks very refined and speaks in a beautiful, refined literary language in each of the multiple languages that she speaks. I couldn't have even imagined like Ola raising her voice to anyone. And suddenly she's out there in the middle of the night in sub-freezing temperatures crushing bricks and building barricades. And Ola is not the brick-crushing, barricade-building type. I mean, she's no more likely to be doing that than I am, and she wouldn't have believed it of herself, a few weeks earlier. And I wanted to capture that, how like that transformation people had, and also the way in which people started using the phrase, and then I made a choice. But that was my choice, and then this moment came and I made a choice, and this phrase kept coming up in all sorts of different languages, and then I made a choice. And of course in existentialism, for those of you who remember Sartre, the key moment is making a decision. You're nothing until you act. Existence precedes essence. The key moment of your life is making a decision. But we usually we're not aware of that. We don't notice it. And as I forced all my students after the Maidan to suffer through a lot of philosophy of time, we read Husserl, we read Sartre, we read Heidegger, we read trying to figure out what happens to time. What is a subjective experience of time? When does a subjective experience deviate from the objective experience? And what I found in Sartre was actually very helpful for understanding the Maidan, because Sartre says, well, the present is always a problem for philosophers, because the present has no duration. You can't grab a hold of it. As soon as you try to get a hold of it, it's already gone. It's always either past or future. It's this imperceptible punctuality, the present. And Sartre says, well, what the present is, it has no duration. The present is a border. It's a border between what he calls the en soi and the pour soi, the in itself and the for itself, otherwise known as the border between facticity and transcendence. And so the en soi facticity is everything that is fixed, that is determined, that is inert, that has already happened, that cannot be changed. It is everything that's happened and everything that's been done and everything you have been and who you have been up to this moment. And the pour soi transcendence is the possibility of going beyond that. As you move from the past into the future, you cross that border in which what has been opens into the possibility of what can be, the possibility of going beyond. And that moment, that border is with us all the time. We're making decisions all the time, where we will go. But we normally don't notice it. And what I saw on the Maidan, and I thought maybe this is part of a kind of universal essence, of revolution that the Maidan can illuminate, is that the present as the border, as the moment of crossing from facticity to transcendence, from who you have been to what you can be, it's suddenly illuminated. Like you suddenly cast a shining light on something that's usually half in shadow. And that was a beautiful thing to see. And I think that whatever happens politically, and whatever successes or disasters there are to come, I think that changed people. I don't think people who went through that will ever be the same. Let me just maybe say a word or two in conclusion. As you all know, it ends in a massacre. Yanukovych flees across the border to Russia. Paul Manafort is then out of a job. We know what happens next. I don't think it's a coincidence that it was Frank Foer, who at that time was the editor of the New Republican. I met him in Kiev in spring of 2014. He was kind of fascinated by trying to figure out what was happening in Ukraine and how Yanukovych came back. I don't think it's a coincidence that, 2 years later it was Frank Foer who broke the Paul Manafort story during the Trump campaign. With an article in Slate saying, hey, if you don't think Trump can win this election, you don't know who Paul Manafort is. The historian Ilya Gerasimov says, with the Maidan, the postmodern ended in Ukraine. And you were, back or ahead, to the moment where there was once again such a thing as a real subject, as real meaning, as real truth. And then that turns in a kind of instant, afterwards, into a kind of grotesque war in the Donbass, and into a kind of explosion of a kind of the darkest postmodern post-truth, in which truly all that is solid melts into air. And from a sense of coming to understand who you are in a new way, which I think was central on the Maidan, you move into a war that seems to be all about a kind of crisis of subjectivity. That one of the stories I tell in this book, my friend Katya told me. She's from Donetsk. She's a graduate student in media studies and was one of the curators of this kind of art discussion collective called Izolyatsiya in Donetsk. And their space, their gallery space, was then taken over by the separatists and turned into a prison, and Katya fled to Kiev. And we're sitting in this Japanese tea house in Podil, and she's trying very calmly, kind of in Russian, to narrate what was happening and who were these different groups of people coming and who could figure out who they were. And then she's like, and then one day the Chechens come, and they don't even speak English very well. They don't even speak Russian very well, and they don't understand why they're getting Ukrainian currency and not Russian currency from the bank machines. And then they call a meeting on Lenin Square. And Katya says, and then this elderly, Orthodox Christian grandmother comes to the meeting on Lenin Square and gives an Orthodox christening to the Chechen soldier so that he'll be victorious in battle against the Ukrainian Nazis. And Katya's like, this is all completely surreal, because you have the Christian woman on the communist square giving an Orthodox christening to a Muslim soldier so that he can go kill non-existent Ukrainian Nazis. Everything is fictitious, and everything is happening. And that moment of all that is solid melts into air, and nobody any longer knows kind of who is who, which I try to kind of capture in the epilogue of this book. Not just why war is grotesque. I mean, I think everybody understands why war is grotesque. But this kind of fictitious quality, where the young Polish journalist Paweł Pieniążek, I think, wrote some of the very best reportage. And he describes, being in the Donbass, and people are shooting and no one knows what's happening, and the older people are asking, Nashi? Like, are they on our side? Are they on our side? And he's trying to figure out what they mean by our side. And realizes that nobody really knows. Because nobody really knows who is who. Serhii Zhadan wrote a poem 3 years into war, and it was just translated very beautifully by Valzina Mort for this new collection. And I'll just maybe end by reading you a couple lines from that. They buried him last winter. Which side was he fighting for? I ask. What a question, they say. One of the sides. Who could figure them out? And so that, maybe I want to leave you with the thought that the experience of the Maidan and then moving into the war in the Donbass, it illuminates anew that border between modernity and postmodernity. And even though everything looks very bleak at the moment, and it seems to be basically a disaster in Ukraine and a disaster in Poland and God knows a disaster in the United States, I still kind of hold on to that memory of the Maidan. You know, I think in the way that people like Adam Michnik do, not because they're naive idealists or not because they think it's all going to be okay, but because they know that if people have that capacity, you know, to go beyond themselves, to illuminate that moment of crossing the border, to take responsibility, even if that ability kind of shows itself only in a flicker of a second, and even if it's never been sustained, the fact that it can exist at all, that lost treasure of revolution, means that somehow we have that capacity in us. Thank you.